Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Imagine you're aboard a wooden vessel somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea. 2,000 years ago, the sky has turned the color of wet iron. Waves crash over the deck with enough force to knock grown men off their feet. Passengers scream and pray, clutching whatever they can find. Some weep openly, certain these are their final moments. The ship lurches violently to one side, then the other, as if the sea itself has decided to shake everyone loose into its depths. In the midst of this chaos stands a single man, utterly calm. His name is Pyrrho. He's not praying, not grasping the mast, not even looking particularly concerned. Instead, he's pointing at something near his feet. A small pig, completely oblivious to the storm, calmly munching on some scattered grain. The animal's total lack of awareness, its simple contentment in the face of potential death, seems to amuse Pyrrho. According to those who witnessed this moment, he turns to his terrified companions and suggests they should all be more like the pig. Most people hearing this story assume Pyrrho was joking, or perhaps mocking his frightened fellow travellers, but he wasn't. This wasn't philosophy as performance or clever wordplay. This was the lived reality of a man who had found something most of us spend our entire lives seeking and never find. Not through certainty, not through knowledge, not through any of the paths we're told lead to inner peace. Pyrrho had discovered tranquility through the most unexpected route imaginable. He had achieved profound calm by systematically doubting absolutely everything. This is the story of the Ancient Greek Skeptics, a group of philosophers who turned the entire project of philosophy on its head. Where others sought truth, they questioned whether truth could be found. Where others built elaborate systems of knowledge, they developed elegant methods for dismantling every claim to certainty. Where others found anxiety in not knowing, they discovered that uncertainty itself could become a gateway to the deepest peace the human mind can experience. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, we'll walk through the strange and beautiful world of philosophical skepticism. We'll meet figures who challenged everything their culture held sacred, who lived by principles that seemed impossible to follow, and who somehow found in radical doubt what others sought in dogmatic belief. This isn't philosophy as intellectual exercise. This is philosophy as a way of being, a path to tranquility that required more courage than any heroic deed. The journey begins not in the lecture halls of Athens, but on the dusty roads of Asia, in the court of Alexander the Great, where a Greek painter named Pyrrho would encounter ideas that would change the course of Western thought forever. The world into which Pyrrho was born, around 360 years before the Common Era, was one of extraordinary intellectual ferment. This was the late classical period when Greek civilization had reached heights of cultural achievement that still astound us today. But it was also a time of deep philosophical anxiety. The old certainties were crumbling. The gods of Homer seemed increasingly like beautiful fictions. The perfect forms of Plato appeared suspect to many. Even Aristotle's careful observations raised as many questions as they answered. Into this uncertain world came Pyrrho of Elis, a city on the western coast of the Peloponnese. We know frustratingly little about his early life. Ancient sources tell us he may have started as a painter, creating what one later observer dismissed as mediocre torch runners for the gymnasium walls. But something drew him away from pigments and panels toward questions that couldn't be answered with a brush. What we do know is that Pyrrho studied under a philosopher named Ataraxia, who had himself been influenced by the atomist teachings of Democritus. This matters because Democritus had already planted seeds of doubt about the reliability of our senses, and the great atomist had famously declared that by convention there is sweetness, by convention bitterness, by convention color, but in reality there are only atoms and void. If our most basic perceptions might be misleading, what could we really know about the world? But the transformative moment in Pyrrho's life came when Anaxarchus was invited to join Alexander the Great's expedition to the east. Pyrrho accompanied his teacher on this journey into lands the Greeks barely understood. They travelled through Persia, into what is now Afghanistan, and eventually deep into India. This wasn't a philosophical tourism. Alexander's campaigns were brutal, bloody affairs. Pyrrho would have witnessed violence on an unimaginable scale, the collision of civilizations, the provisional nature of power and glory. More importantly, in India, Pyrrho encountered the Gymnosophists, the naked wise men. These were likely Hindu or Jain ascetics, though our sources are unclear. What struck Pyrrho and his contemporaries was that these Eastern sages had developed their own sophisticated philosophical traditions completely independent of Greek thought. They had different answers to the big questions. Their certainties contradicted Greek certainties, and yet they seemed equally convinced, equally rational in their argumentation. One story, preserved centuries later, claims that a gymnosophist reproached Anaxarchus for his association with royal courts, suggesting that true wisdom required detachment from worldly power. Whether this actually happened or is merely legend, it points to something crucial. Pyrrho returned from India having seen multiple systems of thought, each internally coherent, each claiming to grasp ultimate truth, each contradicting the others. If equally intelligent, equally earnest people could reach completely opposite conclusions about reality, ethics, and the gods, what did that say about the possibility of knowledge itself? When Pyrrho returned to Elis around 325 BCE, he was a changed man. But change might be too weak a word. He had undergone a transformation so complete that his fellow citizens barely recognized the philosophical stance he now embodied. And here we encounter one of the great ironies of Western philosophy. The man who would inspire a school of thought that dominated skeptical philosophy for centuries, who would be cited as an authority by philosophers from the 1st century BCE through the 3rd century CE, wrote absolutely nothing. Not a single word of Pyrrho's philosophy comes to us in his own hand. No treatises, no dialogues, no letters. Some of this may have been deliberate. Writing things down implies a kind of confidence in one's ideas that would have contradicted everything Pyrrho stood for. But it leaves us in a peculiar position, trying to understand a thinker entirely through the eyes of others, primarily his devoted student Timon of Phlius. Timon adored Pyrrho. This much is clear from the fragments of his writings that survive. He composed poetry and prose celebrating his master's way of life, presenting Pyrrho as having achieved a godlike state of calm, free from the slavery of mere opinion. But Timon's own works are mostly lost to us too. What remains are fragments quoted by later authors, often by people who were hostile to skepticism and may have misrepresented these ideas. The most important testimony we have comes third or fourth hand. A philosopher named Aristocles, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, quoted a passage from Timon's work. This quote was then preserved by the Christian historian Eusebius. These layers of transmission make interpretation treacherous, but this Aristocles passage gives us our best window into what Pyrrho actually taught. According to this testimony, Timon said that Pyrrho believed we must ask 3 questions. First, what are things like by nature? Second, what attitude should we adopt toward them? Third, what will result from adopting this attitude? Pyrrho's answers were revolutionary. Things, he declared, are equally indifferent, unmeasurable, and indeterminate. Our sensations and opinions tell us neither truths nor falsehoods. Therefore, we should not trust them. We should be without opinions, without bias, without wavering, saying of each thing no more that it is than that it is not, or that it both is and is not, or that it neither is nor is not. The result of this attitude, Tiemann reported, would be first speechlessness, then freedom from disturbance. This is ataraxia, the tranquil state that became the goal of Pyrrhonian skepticism, not through achieving certainty, but through accepting that certainty is impossible and learning to be at peace with that impossibility. But these philosophical pronouncements only scratch the surface of who Pyrrho was. To understand the lived reality of skepticism, we need to turn to the stories, the anecdotes that were told and retold about this peculiar sage. Some of these tales are almost certainly exaggerated or entirely fabricated, created by later writers to illustrate or satirize Pyrrho's philosophy. But even the fictional stories reveal how people understood the skeptical way of life. Diogenes Laertius, writing his biographical sketches centuries later, collected numerous anecdotes about Pyrrho. Some paint a picture of a man so detached from ordinary concerns that he became a danger to himself. According to these stories, Pyrrho would walk wherever his feet took him, paying no attention to where he was going. He would step off cliffs, walk in front of moving carts, ignore barking dogs. Only the constant vigilance of his friends kept him from serious harm or death. These stories are probably nonsense. One ancient source, Aenesidemus, explicitly rejected them, saying that while Pyrrho philosophized in accordance with the suspension of judgment, he didn't act carelessly. This makes more sense. A philosophy that led to self-destruction would hardly have attracted followers or allowed Pyrrho to live to a ripe old age, which he apparently did. Other anecdotes ring more true. There's the story of Pyrrho walking past his own teacher Anaxarchus when the latter had fallen into a muddy slough and needed help. Pyrrho simply continued on his way. Rather than being offended, Anaxarchus reportedly praised this action as evidence of Pyrrho's indifference to conventional expectations. Whether true or not, the story illustrates a key point. The skeptic doesn't act from unexamined social pressures, but from rational consideration of what appearances suggest should be done. Pyrrho was also said to perform tasks that his society considered beneath the dignity of a philosopher. He would take animals to market to sell them. He would wash pigs. He would clean his own house. For a culture that sharply divided mental and manual labor, this was shocking. But from a skeptical perspective, why should one type of work be inherently more valuable than another? These judgments were just conventions, customs that varied from place to place and time to time. One story shows Pyrrho failing to live up to his own philosophy, which makes it more credible. He was once attacked by a vicious dog and responded with fear, jumping back or running away. Later, he apologized to his friends for this lapse, admitting that it was difficult to completely strip oneself of human weakness. This humility, this acknowledgement that perfect skepticism might be an ideal never fully realized, makes Pyrrho more human and his philosophy more honest. But the most famous anecdote, the one that's been depicted in Renaissance paintings and quoted by philosophers for centuries, brings us back to that storm-tossed ship. The historian Posidonius recorded that when Pyrrho's fellow passengers were terrified by a violent storm at sea, Pyrrho remained composed. He pointed to a small pig on the deck that was calmly eating its food, utterly unaware of the danger, and told his companions that this was the untroubled state in which a wise person should remain. The story has been interpreted many ways. Some see it as praising animal-like ignorance, others view it as satire, mocking philosophical pretensions. But the most compelling reading treats it seriously. The pig wasn't worried because it didn't understand what was happening. It had no beliefs about storms, no judgments about death, no elaborate theories about what might occur. It simply responded to immediate sensations, eating when food was available. Pyrrho wasn't suggesting we become literal pigs. He was pointing to something profound about the relationship between belief and suffering. The other passengers weren't suffering because of the storm itself. They were suffering because of their beliefs about the storm, their judgments about what it meant, their certainty that they were going to die. The physical sensations of being tossed about on rough seas are unpleasant, certainly. But the terror, the anguish, the despair came from their mental activity, from the way they interpreted and reacted to those sensations. If you could suspend those judgments, if you could refrain from adding your certainties about meaning and outcome to the raw experience, you might find a kind of peace, even in objectively dangerous situations. Not the peace of stupidity, but the peace that comes from recognizing that your interpretations might be wrong, that reality might be other than your beliefs suggest, that certainty about disaster is just another form of dogmatism. This brings us to the heart of Pyrrho's philosophy. The technical term is epoché, the suspension of judgment. It's often misunderstood as mere indecisiveness or an inability to commit. But epoché is something far more radical and far more difficult. It's the active practice of noticing when you're about to make a judgment and choosing not to. Consider a simple example. You see a sunset and think it's beautiful. That seems innocent enough. But the skeptic would notice that different people have different aesthetic judgments. Some cultures prize sunsets, others barely notice them. Your judgment that the sunset is beautiful is not a perception of an objective property of the sunset itself, but a reaction shaped by your particular sensory apparatus, your cultural conditioning, your current mood. The sunset isn't inherently beautiful or ugly, it just is. Your judgment adds something that wasn't there. Now extend this to everything. Moral judgments about good and evil, metaphysical claims about what exists, epistemological assertions about what can be known. Every one of these involves taking your particular perspective, shaped by your biology, your culture, your experiences, and treating it as if it revealed objective truth. But why should your perspective be privileged over anyone else's? What makes you so certain? The Aristocles passage gives us that strange formula that became central to Pyrrhonism. Of anything, we should say no more that it is than that it is not, or that it both is and is not, or that it neither is nor is not. This sounds like word games, like the worst kind of philosophical sophistry, but it's actually a precise tool for maintaining epoché. It's a way of speaking that prevents you from making definite assertions while still acknowledging the appearances. When someone asks you whether the honey is sweet, you don't say yes or no. You say it appears sweet to you now, but it might appear bitter to someone with a fever, or to a bee, or to you later. You're not denying the appearance of sweetness. You're refusing to make the leap from appearance to reality, from how things seem to how things are. This led Pyrrho, according to Timon, to a state of aphasia, speechlessness, not literal silence, but a kind of philosophical quiet. When you stop making assertions about the ultimate nature of reality, you stop engaging in the endless arguments that consume most philosophical discourse. You stop defending positions, attacking alternatives, building elaborate theoretical structures that will only be torn down by the next clever argument. And in that quiet, something unexpected happens. You find ataraxia, freedom from disturbance, tranquility. The word comes from tarasein, to disturb or trouble, with the prefix a meaning without. It's a state of profound mental calm, not the calm of ignorance, but the calm of accepted uncertainty. But how does suspending judgment lead to peace? The psychological mechanism is subtle but powerful. Much of human suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our judgments about those events. We suffer not because we lost something, but because we judge that thing as essential to our happiness. We suffer not because someone criticized us, but because we judge their criticism as a threat to our worth. We suffer not because the future is uncertain, but because we judge that uncertainty as intolerable. Pyrrho noticed that these judgments are based on beliefs that can't be definitively proven. You believe wealth is necessary for happiness, but others are happy without it. You believe this person's opinion matters, but that's just your judgment. You believe certainty is necessary, but that belief itself creates the suffering. When you suspend these judgments, when you hold your beliefs lightly, recognizing they're just one possible interpretation among many, their power over you diminishes. This doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent to suffering. The skeptic still acts, still makes choices, still has preferences. But these are held loosely, treated as provisional responses to how things appear, rather than as absolute truths about how things are. You might prefer health to sickness, but you don't create elaborate philosophies claiming health is objectively good. You act on the preference, while remaining aware it's just an appearance, subject to all the uncertainties Pyrrho outlined. This way of life required tremendous philosophical sophistication. It wasn't laziness or simplicity, it was the result of thinking very carefully about the limits of human knowledge and the sources of human suffering, and it was, by all accounts, extremely effective. Pyrrho was remembered not primarily for his arguments, but for his remarkable composure. He achieved something his contemporaries desperately sought. He found peace. The city of Elis honored Pyrrho by making him high priest of their temple and exempting all philosophers from taxation on his account. He lived out his days in his hometown apparently content, having discovered through radical doubt what others sought through elaborate systems of certain knowledge. When he died around 270 BCE, he left no writings, no established school, no institutional legacy. Just the memory of a way of being that seemed impossible and yet had been lived. But that memory was enough. Because several centuries later, a philosopher named Aenesidemus would read about Pyrrho and decide that ancient skepticism needed to be revived, and in reviving it, he would give later generations the systematic tools they needed to practice the epoché that Pyrrho had embodied. The 10 modes of skepticism were about to emerge, elegant arguments that would show in precise detail why our claims to knowledge rest on shakier ground than we'd like to admit. Aenesidemus lived in the 1st century before the Common Era, a time when skepticism had transformed but not disappeared. After Pyrrho's death, his most devoted student, Timon, had kept the flame alive for a while. But with Timon's passing, Pyrrhonism seemed to fade. The skeptical torch had been picked up instead by Plato's Academy in Athens, where it would burn in a different way. But Aenesidemus felt that academic skepticism had become too comfortable, too willing to make positive claims. He wanted to return to what he saw as the purer skepticism of Pyrrho. We know even less about Aenesidemus's life than Pyrrho's. He came from Knossos on Crete. He was apparently associated with the academy at some point, studying there before becoming disillusioned with its direction. His major work, the Pyrrhonian Discourses, consisted of 8 books. Like so much of ancient philosophy, it's completely lost. We have only a summary preserved by a Byzantine scholar named Photius, writing in the 9th century. That's roughly a 1,000-year gap between composition and our earliest substantial account of it. What Photius tells us is tantalizing. Aenesidemus's work apparently laid out the differences between Pyrrhonism and academic skepticism, explained the philosophy's goals, and most importantly, systematized the modes or tropes of skepticism. These were stock arguments, templates that could be applied to any dogmatic claim to show why we should suspend judgment about it. 10 modes in particular became central to the Pyrrhonian tradition. They're attributed to Aenesidemus, though it's unclear whether he invented them or collected them from earlier skeptical sources. These modes are beautiful pieces of philosophical machinery. Each one starts with observations everyone could accept and uses them to show why we can't be certain about the nature of reality. They don't prove that things are unknowable in some absolute sense. They simply demonstrate that our grounds for claiming to know are insufficient. Let me walk you through each mode, taking time to appreciate their elegant construction. The first mode depends on the diversity of animal life. Different animals have different sensory organs. A dog's nose is far more sensitive than ours. An eagle's vision is sharper. A bat perceives sound-based images we can barely imagine. Some creatures see colors we can't detect. Others experience time at different rates. When a dog smells a piece of meat, it perceives all sorts of chemical information we miss entirely. The meat appears differently to the dog than to us, but which appearance is correct? Which perception reveals the true nature of the meat? We have no non-circular way to answer that question. We can't step outside all possible perspectives to see what the meat is really like independent of any observer. The dog can't judge our perception and we can't fully judge the dog's. So how can either of us claim our perception reveals truth? The second mode shifts to variations among humans themselves. Some people love cilantro, others find it tastes like soap. This isn't mere preference. They're actually tasting different things because of genetic differences in their chemical receptors. Some people are colorblind, others have absolute pitch. These aren't defects exactly, just variations. So when two people taste the same food and have different experiences, whose experience reveals the true nature of the food? Both? Neither? Something in between? The question has no obvious answer. The third mode examines differences among our senses. Hold a coin at arm's length. To your eyes, it appears round. To your fingers, it appears to have a sharp edge. Which is the true appearance? Sound travels at a different speed than light. So we might see something before we hear it, or vice versa. Temperature feels different on different parts of your body. The same water can feel hot to one hand and cold to the other if they've been conditioned differently. So even within a single person, the senses contradict each other. Which sense should we trust? The fourth mode notes that our perceptions change based on our condition. Food tastes different when you're sick than when you're healthy. Colors appear different when you're drunk than when you're sober. Everything looks different when you're falling in love. Your perception of pain changes with your level of fatigue. The same sound can be pleasantly stimulating when you're alert and intolerably grating when you're trying to sleep. So which perception is correct? The one you have in your current state, or the one you'll have in a different state? Both equally claim to reveal how things are, yet they contradict each other. The fifth mode concerns position and distance. A square tower appears round from far away. A straight oar appears bent when half submerged in water. The size of the moon appears to change depending on where it is in the sky. Paintings look different depending on the angle from which you view them. So the appearance of objects depends on your spatial relationship to them. But where's the privileged position from which you see the object as it truly is? Every position is just another position, no more revealing than any other. The sixth mode looks at mixtures and combinations. Nothing is perceived in isolation. We always perceive things in context, surrounded by other things mixed with the medium through which we perceive them. The color of an object looks different depending on what colors surround it. The taste of wine changes depending on what food you just ate. The smell of a perfume varies depending on the air quality and what other scents are present. Even our thoughts are influenced by the stream of other thoughts around them. So we never perceive the thing itself, only the thing as it appears when combined with its context. The seventh mode examines quantity and composition. The same substance in different amounts can have opposite effects. A small amount of wine might relax you, a large amount might make you sick. A single grain of sand appears insignificant. A beach of sand can stop an army. The same particles arranged differently produce completely different substances. Carbon arranged one way is graphite, arranged another way is diamond. So what something appears to be depends on how much of it there is and how it's arranged, not on some inherent nature independent of these factors. The eighth mode is about relativity in a broader sense. Everything we perceive is perceived in relation to something else. This object is heavy relative to that one, hot relative to another, good relative to some standard. Remove the point of comparison and the judgment becomes meaningless. But if all our perceptions are relative, we never perceive absolute properties, only relationships. And relationships can't tell us what things are in themselves, only how they stand to other things. The ninth mode considers frequency and familiarity. The rare seems wonderful, the common seems ordinary. But this is clearly a fact about our psychology, not about the nature of the things themselves. A perfect sunset happens every day somewhere, but we only notice it when we're in the right place at the right time. After you live somewhere for a while, you stop seeing it as clearly. This mode shows that our judgments are colored by habituation in ways we rarely notice. The 10th mode focuses on customs, laws, beliefs, and cultural practices. Different societies have radically different views about what's permissible, what's sacred, what's beautiful, what's shameful. The Greeks thought exposure of the body shameful. The Gymnosophists went naked. Some cultures practice polygamy, others find it abhorrent. Some eat certain animals, others worship them. These aren't just different practices, they're based on different beliefs about what's good, true, and natural. If equally intelligent people in different cultures reach opposite conclusions about fundamental matters, on what basis can any of them claim certainty? Each mode works by showing that our perception or judgment varies based on factors that seem arbitrary. If your perception changes based on whether you're human or dog, healthy or sick, near or far, alone or surrounded, in one culture or another, then your perception isn't revealing an objective property of reality. It's revealing the interaction between you and reality, filtered through all these varying conditions. The modes work together. You can combine them, showing how multiple sources of variation all affect a single perception, and they're designed to lead to epoché. Once you see how many contingent factors shape every judgment you make, how can you be confident that any judgment reveals the truth? The rational response is to suspend judgment, to stop claiming certainty about matters that appear differently under different conditions. But Aenesidemus went further. He apparently developed 8 additional modes, specifically targeting causal explanations. How do we know one thing causes another? Through repeated observation, but we only observe correlation, not causation, because of some theoretical understanding. But that theory is based on assumptions that themselves need justification. The problems multiply endlessly. What Aenesidemus created was a comprehensive skeptical toolkit. Give him any dogmatic claim and he could deploy the appropriate modes to show why certainty was unjustified. This wasn't mere negativity, it was medicine for the philosophical disease of overconfidence. The dogmatists, as the skeptics called believers in positive doctrines, exhausted themselves in futile theorizing, building elaborate systems that contradicted each other, creating anxiety over which system was correct. The skeptic, by suspending judgment, stepped out of that exhausting competition and found peace. Around the same time that Aenesidemus was reviving Pyrrhonism, the skeptical tradition that had developed in Plato's Academy was reaching its twilight. This academic skepticism had its own fascinating history, different from Pyrrhonism in important ways, but equally committed to questioning dogmatic certainty. To understand the full landscape of ancient skepticism, we need to journey back to Athens and watch how the Academy itself became skeptical. The transformation began with Arcesilaus, who became head of the Academy around 264 BCE. This was about 80 years after Plato's death. The Academy had gone through several leaders, each putting their own stamp on Platonic thought. But Arcesilaus did something radical. He claimed to be returning to the authentic Socratic method, stripping away later accretions to recover the original spirit of philosophical inquiry. Socrates, as portrayed in Plato's early dialogues, rarely made positive claims. He asked questions, he examined other people's beliefs. When someone claimed to know what justice was or what courage meant, Socrates would question them until contradictions emerged. He ended these dialogues not with answers, but with aporia, a state of puzzlement. Socrates famously claimed to know nothing except that he knew nothing, though even that he held with some uncertainty. Arcesilaus saw this not as a limitation, but as philosophical virtue. The examined life didn't mean the life that arrives at certain truths. It meant the life that never stops examining, that refuses to settle into comfortable dogmas. So Arcesilaus began teaching a form of skepticism, arguing against whatever position his interlocutors held. If someone claimed knowledge was possible, he'd argue it wasn't. If someone claimed knowledge was impossible, he'd argue against that too. His primary target was the Stoic school, which had recently been founded by Zeno of Citium. The Stoics had developed an elaborate epistemological theory centered on what they called the cataleptic impression. This was supposed to be a perception so clear, so compelling, so obviously true that it forced assent. The cataleptic impression carried its own guarantee of truth. When you had one, you couldn't be mistaken. Arcesilaus demolished this theory with characteristic elegance. He pointed out that false impressions can feel just as compelling as true ones. Someone in a dream or suffering a hallucination can be absolutely certain they're perceiving reality correctly. Madness feels like sanity from the inside. No impression, no matter how vivid, carries an intrinsic mark guaranteeing its truth. You can't tell from the quality of an impression alone whether it's reliable, so the Stoic criterion of truth fails. More broadly, Arcesilaus argued that nothing could be known with certainty. This sounds like a dogmatic claim itself, and his critics pounced on this apparent contradiction. If you claim to know that nothing can be known, aren't you making a knowledge claim? Arcesilaus had an answer, though scholars debate exactly what it was. He might have said that even the claim that nothing can be known should be doubted, or he might have avoided claiming certainty about even that, instead just arguing against other people's claims to knowledge without making positive assertions himself. What's clear is that Arcesilaus saw value in the practice of arguing both sides of every question. This wasn't fence-sitting or intellectual cowardice. It was a systematic method for revealing how every position has arguments against it, how certainty always exceeds the evidence. When you can argue equally well for and against any proposition, the rational response is to suspend judgment, to admit you don't know. But here's where academic skepticism differed from Pyrrhonism in a crucial way. For Pyrrho and his followers, the goal of epoché was explicitly ataraxia. Suspending judgment led to tranquility. Arcesilaus didn't emphasize this psychological benefit. His focus was more purely epistemological. The point wasn't peace of mind, but intellectual honesty. You shouldn't claim to know what you don't know. That's a matter of philosophical integrity, whether or not it makes you calmer. There were practical consequences, though. If you can't know anything with certainty, how do you live? How do you make decisions? The Stoics argued that without certain knowledge, action becomes impossible. Arcesilaus responded with the concept of the reasonable. Even without certainty, some actions appear more reasonable than others given the circumstances. You can act on what seems plausible, what appears likely, while still acknowledging that appearances can mislead. This is living by probability rather than truth, action without dogma. Arcesilaus left no writings. Like Pyrrho, he taught orally, and we know him only through later reports. But his influence on the academy was profound. For the next 2 centuries, the academy would be skeptical, challenging other schools, while refusing to develop its own positive doctrines. The most famous academic skeptic after Arcesilaus was Carneades, and with him, the tradition reached new heights of sophistication. Carneades led the academy in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. He was renowned as perhaps the most brilliant dialectician Athens had ever produced, capable of arguing any side of any question with devastating effectiveness. His reputation spread beyond Greece to Rome, which had become the rising power in the Mediterranean world. And in 155 BCE, Athens sent Carneades as part of a diplomatic mission to Rome, an event that would have unexpected philosophical consequences. The Romans were pragmatic people, suspicious of Greek philosophy as impractical sophistication, but they were curious too, drawn to Greek culture even as they conquered Greek territories. When Carneades arrived, he gave a series of public lectures that shocked the Romans and gave them their first real taste of philosophical argument. On one day, he delivered a powerful speech in favor of justice, arguing that it was natural, universal, and essential for society. He spoke brilliantly, defending justice with every argument available. The Romans were impressed. Here was Greek wisdom confirming their own values. The next day, Carneades delivered another speech, this time arguing against justice. He showed that what different societies call justice varies wildly. That justice is often a mask for power, that individuals and nations act in their own interest while claiming to be just, that there's no natural law of justice, only conventions that serve the strong. He argued this just as brilliantly as he'd defended justice the day before. The Romans were scandalized. The conservative statesman Cato the Elder was so disturbed that he urged the Senate to send the Greek philosophers home as quickly as possible before they corrupted Roman youth with their clever arguments. But the damage, if you want to call it that, was done. Romans had seen for themselves the power of skeptical argumentation. Within a generation, educated Romans would be studying Greek philosophy seriously. Carneades had planted seeds that would eventually transform Roman intellectual culture. But his performance wasn't mere showmanship. It illustrated a fundamental skeptical principle. For any position on any disputed question, you can construct strong arguments both for and against it. The arguments don't cancel each other out exactly, but they create equivalence, an equal balance that makes certainty impossible. When arguments of equal strength point in opposite directions, the rational response is to suspend judgment. Carneades developed this into a comprehensive critique of Stoic philosophy. He attacked their theology, showing that arguments for divine providence were matched by equally strong arguments against it. How can the gods care for humanity when innocents suffer and the wicked prosper? The Stoics had answers, but Carneades had counter-arguments, and the debate could never be conclusively resolved. He dismantled Stoic physics, ethics, logic, showing contradictions and unwarranted assumptions throughout their system. What made Carneades particularly formidable was that he didn't just attack positions actually held by opponents. He anticipated possible positions, developing arguments against views no one had yet defended. This created a kind of comprehensive skepticism. He mapped the logical space of possible positions and showed why none of them could be established with certainty. But Carneades also went beyond Arcesilaus in addressing the problem of action. He developed a more sophisticated theory of how to live without certainty. His concept of tupithanon has been translated as either the plausible or the probable. Carneades argued that we should act based on what appears most plausible given the evidence, while remaining aware that appearances can mislead. He identified different degrees of plausibility. Some appearances are just moderately convincing. Others are not only convincing in themselves, but also consistent with surrounding circumstances, which makes them more reliable. The most reliable appearances are those that are intrinsically convincing, consistent with context, and have been tested by careful examination. You act on these most reliable appearances while still acknowledging their not certain truth. It's created a kind of graduated skepticism. You're not completely paralyzed, unable to prefer anything over anything else. You make discriminations based on how things appear, using reason to evaluate the reliability of appearances, but you never mistake even your most reliable appearances for absolute truth. You remain skeptical in the philosophical sense while being practically engaged with the world. One of Carneades' most devoted students, Clitomachus, reportedly said he never knew what his teacher actually believed about anything. Carneades so thoroughly embodied the practice of arguing both sides that his own views remained hidden. This wasn't evasion, it was the skeptical ideal taken seriously. Why should a skeptic have positive views? Having views means being committed to claims you can't prove, which means abandoning skepticism. But after Carneades, academic skepticism began to soften. His successors, particularly Philo of Larissa, started allowing that some limited knowledge might be possible, at least knowledge of appearances, even if not knowledge of ultimate reality. This struck Aenesidemus as a betrayal of authentic skepticism. It's what motivated him to revive Pyrrhonism, to return to what he saw as the purer skepticism of Pyrrho. He denounced the later academy as Stoics fighting against Stoics, suggesting they'd become just another dogmatic school. The split between academic and Pyrrhonian skepticism became firm. Both questioned dogmatic certainty, but they did so with different emphases, different goals, different attitudes. The academics seemed more interested in epistemology as an abstract problem. The Pyrrhonists focused on epoché as a path to ataraxia, on skepticism as a therapeutic practice that cured the disease of dogmatic anxiety. This brings us to Sextus Empiricus, the last great voice of ancient skepticism and the source through which much of the tradition became known to later ages. Sextus lived in the 2nd or possibly 3rd century of the Common Era. By this time, the Academy was no longer skeptical. Pyrrhonism too was a marginal movement, kept alive by a few adherents. But Sextus preserved the tradition in the most comprehensive account of skepticism that survives from antiquity. We know almost nothing about Sextus as a person. His very name is slightly mysterious. He's called Empiricus because he practiced medicine in the empirical school, one of 3 major medical traditions in the ancient world. The empiricists believed medicine should be based on careful observation of what treatments work, not on theoretical explanations of why they work. This fit well with skepticism's rejection of theoretical knowledge in favor of relying on appearances. But Sextus also wrote that while Pyrrhonism is compatible with empirical medicine, it might be even more compatible with another school called Methodism. This school treated disease by observing obvious features like whether the patient's condition involved constriction or dilation, excess or deficiency, without theorizing about hidden causes. The point is that Sextus saw connections between medical practice and philosophical skepticism, both emphasizing observation and practical results over theoretical explanation. Sextus's major work, The Outlines of Pyrrhonism, has no parallel in ancient philosophy. It's a systematic presentation of skeptical philosophy as a complete way of life. Divided into 3 books, it lays out the skeptical position, distinguishes it from other philosophical approaches, and applies skeptical arguments to every area of philosophy. Logic, physics, ethics, mathematics, music theory, grammar, nothing escapes Sextus's skeptical scrutiny. The opening sections define what skepticism is and isn't. Sextus calls Pyrrhonism an ability, a skill of setting up oppositions in appearances and thoughts in any way whatever, so that through the equipollence of the opposed objects and accounts, we come first to suspension of judgment and then to tranquility. Notice that ataraxia is explicitly the goal. This is Pyrrhonism, not academic skepticism. The point isn't just intellectual honesty, but peace of mind. Sextus carefully distinguishes skeptics from other philosophical schools. The dogmatists claim to have found truth. The negative dogmatists claim truth cannot be found. The skeptics continue investigating, neither asserting that truth has been found nor that it cannot be found. Skepticism is defined by ongoing inquiry, not by any conclusion about that inquiry's prospects. He presents the 10 Modes of Aenesidemus in detail, explaining how each works and giving numerous examples. He then adds 5 modes attributed to another skeptic named Agrippa. These 5 modes are more abstract, targeting not specific sense perceptions but the structure of arguments themselves. They became even more influential than the 10 modes in later philosophy. The first of Agrippa's modes is disagreement. For any proposition, you can find equally intelligent people who disagree about it. Philosophers have argued about whether things exist, whether we can know anything, what we should do, what is good. There's no consensus. So how do you decide who's right? You'd need some criterion, some standard of judgment. But that criterion is itself subject to disagreement. You can't use reason to justify reason without circularity, and you can't appeal to sense perception to justify sense perception without the same problem. The second mode is infinite regress. To prove any claim, you need evidence. But that evidence itself needs justification. And that justification needs justification. Either the chain goes on infinitely, which means you never actually prove anything, or it stops somewhere. But if it stops, you've accepted something without proof, which undermines the whole enterprise. The third mode is relativity. All our judgments are relative to the one judging. What appears good to one person appears bad to another. What seems true in one context seems false in another. These judgments don't tell us about reality itself, but about reality as filtered through particular perspectives. And we can't get outside perspective to see what reality is like from nowhere in particular. The fourth mode concerns hypothesis. To avoid the infinite regress, dogmatists might say certain principles are self-evident, they don't require proof. But why should we accept these hypotheses? Different schools propose different self-evident principles. What's self-evident to a Stoic isn't self-evident to an Epicurean. Claiming something is self-evident is just another way of admitting you can't prove it. The fifth mode is circular reasoning. You might try to prove A by appealing to B, then prove B by appealing to A, but this doesn't establish anything. It just assumes what you're trying to prove. Yet this trap is hard to avoid. When you try to justify reason itself, you have to use reason. When you try to validate sense perception, you have to rely on sense perception. The circularity seems inescapable. These 5 modes work together to show that any attempt to establish certain knowledge faces insurmountable problems. They're more abstract than the 10 modes, but equally devastating to dogmatic claims, and Sextus deploys them with systematic thoroughness against every philosophical position he examines. The bulk of the outlines consists of applying skeptical arguments to specific topics. Against logic, Sextus shows that criteria of truth contradict each other, that demonstration requires what it's supposed to prove, that signs and proofs face insurmountable difficulties. Against physics, he argues against accounts of cause, motion, time, place, number, matter. Against ethics, he shows that no one has successfully established what's good or bad by nature, that all ethical theories face equally strong objections. But throughout all this, Sextus insists that the skeptic isn't making positive claims. He's not saying these things definitely don't exist or can't be known. He's showing that the arguments dogmatists offer aren't conclusive. This is a crucial distinction. The skeptic doesn't have a theory. He has a practice, a way of approaching claims without becoming committed to them. Living as a skeptic, according to Sextus, means following 4 guidelines. First, follow the guidance of nature, your natural capacities for sensation and thought. Second, be compelled by feelings like hunger and thirst. Third, follow laws and customs without judging them to be absolutely true. Fourth, learn various arts and skills. You live by appearances, responding to how things seem without making metaphysical commitments about how they really are. This sounds strange at first. How can you follow customs without believing they're right? How can you act without believing your actions are good? But the skeptic has a subtle answer. You can follow customs because they're the customs of your society, not because they're objectively correct. You can eat when hungry, not because eating is absolutely good, but because hunger appears unpleasant and eating appears pleasant. You respond to appearances while suspending judgment about what's behind them. The skeptic lives by what Sextus calls the criterion of action, which is the fantasia, the appearance. When crossing a street, you respond to the appearance of a cart coming towards you by moving out of the way. You don't need a theory about the metaphysical nature of carts, the reality of motion, or the objective badness of being hit. The appearance is enough to guide action. This way of living supposedly leads to ataraxia. Why? Because most mental disturbance comes from our judgments, not from appearances themselves. If you judge that wealth is necessary for happiness, losing money causes tremendous distress. If you judge that death is terrible, approaching death fills you with dread. If you judge that this person's opinion reveals your worth, their criticism devastates you. But if you suspend these judgments, the disturbance lessens. The appearances remain. Being poor is less pleasant than being rich in many ways. Physical pain hurts. Criticism stings. But the additional layer of judgment that says this is terrible, this shouldn't be happening, this is catastrophic, that layer is optional, and removing it brings relief. The skeptic experiences the appearance of pain, but doesn't add the belief that pain is objectively bad. He experiences the appearance of loss, but doesn't add the belief that loss destroys happiness. This creates a kind of equanimity, not through achieving perfect knowledge, but through accepting perfect ignorance. Sextus gives a famous analogy. The skeptic is like a painter trying to depict foam on a horse's mouth. The painter tried and tried but couldn't capture the foam's quality. Finally, in frustration, he threw his sponge at the painting. The sponge, loaded with paint, happened to create exactly the effect he'd been unsuccessfully pursuing. The moral is that ataraxia comes accidentally as a byproduct of epoché. You don't achieve tranquility by trying to be tranquil, which would itself be a kind of dogmatic pursuit. You achieve it by suspending judgment, and tranquility follows on its own. But can this actually be lived? Ancient critics didn't think so. Aristocles, the philosopher who preserved Timon's account of Pyrrho, argued that skepticism was inconsistent with living. If you really suspended all judgments, you couldn't act. You couldn't choose one path over another, one food over another, one word over another. You'd be completely paralyzed. And even the skeptics' claim that they investigate is inconsistent with skepticism. Investigation implies believing that investigation is worthwhile, that truth might be found, that distinguishing true from false matters. But these are judgments the skeptic supposedly suspends. For centuries, many philosophers dismissed skepticism as unlivable, a position that could be defended in theory but not practiced in reality. But recent scholarship has been more sympathetic. The skeptic's position is subtle, but it may not be inconsistent. You can investigate without believing investigation will succeed, just as you might buy a lottery ticket without believing you'll win. You can prefer health to sickness based on how they appear, without judging that health is objectively good. You can follow social customs because following them appears pleasant or avoiding punishment appears reasonable, without believing the customs are metaphysically justified. The skeptic lives by appearances, by how things seem, without committing to claims about how things are. This is precarious, uncertain, perpetually provisional. But that's precisely the point. Certainty is what the skeptics rejected as impossible and unnecessary. You can live well, they argued. Without it, in fact, you might live better. What the ancient skeptics offer isn't a method for discovering truth. It's a therapy for the suffering caused by pursuing certainty we can't attain. When we demand answers we can't have, when we insist that our perspective reveals ultimate reality, when we cling to beliefs we can't prove, we create unnecessary anxiety. The dogmatist is like someone trapped in a house, trying to find a way out, running from room to room, each exit blocked. The skeptic stops running, sits down, and notices the house isn't actually on fire. The urgency was self-created. This doesn't mean skepticism is easy. Suspending judgment about things that matter to you is extremely difficult. When someone insults you, try not judging whether the insult is deserved or whether this person's opinion matters. Just notice the appearance, the sensation, without adding interpretive layers. Most people can't do this for even a moment. We're judgment-making machines, constantly assessing, evaluating, interpreting. Epoché requires tremendous discipline and practice. But the skeptics claimed it was possible and worthwhile. They lived it or tried to. Pyrrho pointing to the pig in the storm, Carneades arguing both sides with equal brilliance, Sextus systematically applying skeptical arguments to every philosophical question. These weren't people playing intellectual games. They were attempting to live according to a philosophy they believed could reduce suffering. Their influence rippled through subsequent philosophy in ways both obvious and subtle. When the Renaissance rediscovered Sextus Empiricus, his work sparked a crisis in European thought. Montaigne read Sextus and became skeptical about human pretensions to knowledge. Descartes read Sextus and tried to refute skepticism, but in doing so accepted the skeptical challenge as the starting point for modern philosophy. Hume absorbed skeptical arguments and turned them against assumptions about causation and the self. Kant attempted to navigate between dogmatism and skepticism in a way that still defines philosophy today. But beyond these historical influences, ancient skepticism speaks to contemporary concerns in unexpected ways. We live in an age of information overload where certainty is claimed everywhere and proven nowhere. Political polarization divides people who are all convinced they possess the truth. Social media amplifies our confirmation biases, showing us only what reinforces our existing beliefs. Anxiety disorders plague societies built on the premise that we must always know, always decide, always be certain. Ancient skepticism suggests a different possibility. What if we acknowledged our limitations more honestly? What if we held our beliefs more lightly, recognizing them as provisional interpretations rather than certain truths? What if we could disagree without demonizing, recognizing that equally intelligent people can reach different conclusions from the same evidence? What if we found peace not in achieving certainty, but in accepting uncertainty? This doesn't mean abandoning all standards, embracing relativism, or giving up on truth. The skeptics didn't do that. They continued investigating, continued making distinctions, continued acting based on how things appeared. They just stopped pretending they had access to ultimate truth, stopped assuming their perspective was privileged, stopped demanding more certainty than evidence could provide. In an age of epistemic humility, this might be valuable. When we encounter views different from our own, we might suspend judgment about who's right rather than immediately defending our position. When we feel certain about something, we might pause and consider the factors that shape that certainty, recognizing they could have been different. When anxiety arises from not knowing what to do, we might notice that the demand for certainty is causing the anxiety, not the situation itself. Modern psychology has discovered something similar through different paths. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches people to notice their thoughts without immediately believing them, to recognize that thoughts are just thoughts, not facts. Acceptance and commitment therapy encourages psychological flexibility, holding beliefs lightly rather than rigidly. Mindfulness practices cultivate awareness of mental activity without identifying with it. All of these approaches echo something the skeptics understood 2 millennia ago. Our judgments create much of our suffering. Learning to suspend them brings relief. This doesn't make ancient skepticism a self-help technique. It was a rigorous philosophical position with sophisticated arguments and serious theoretical commitments, or rather, a serious commitment to avoiding theoretical commitments. But it had practical applications because it was developed as a way of life, not just a way of thinking. The Ataraxia, it promised, wasn't mystical bliss, but the ordinary peace that comes from stopping the anxious search for impossible certainty. The central paradox remains as puzzling and profound as ever. How can not knowing lead to peace? Shouldn't uncertainty be disturbing? The skeptic's answer is that it depends on how you relate to uncertainty. If you demand certainty, if you believe you must have definitive answers to life's big questions, then uncertainty is torturous. Your grasp at whatever seems certain, defending it desperately, disturbed by every challenge. But if you accept that certainty isn't necessary, that you can live well without it, uncertainty loses its sting. You're free to investigate without the pressure to conclude, free to consider alternative views without feeling threatened, free to change your mind without feeling you've failed. This freedom, this lightness, this ability to engage with ideas and experiences without clinging to them, that's what the skeptics meant by ataraxia. Not the peace of having all the answers, but the peace of not needing them. Not the tranquility of perfect knowledge, but the tranquility of perfect acceptance of ignorance. Think again of Pyrrho on that storm-tossed ship, pointing to the pig. The other passengers were terrified because they were certain the ship would sink, certain they would die, certain this was catastrophic. Their certainty created their suffering. The pig had no such certainties. It simply responded to immediate sensations, eating when food was available. Pyrrho, through years of philosophical practice, had learned to suspend the judgments that create terror. He still perceived the storm. He still experienced the physical sensations of the ship pitching, but he didn't add the layer of interpretation that said, "This means I'm doomed." He held that possible interpretation lightly, balanced against other possibilities, and found in that suspension of judgment a kind of peace the other passengers couldn't imagine. This is the gift ancient skepticism offers, not a method for finding truth, not a way to achieve certain knowledge, but a practice for living with uncertainty gracefully. It suggests that what we usually take as a problem, our inability to be certain about ultimate questions, might actually be an opportunity. We can stop exhausting ourselves pursuing impossible certainty. We can relax the grip of our convictions. We can investigate freely because we're not committed to specific conclusions. We can change our minds easily because we never fully made them up. The skeptical life isn't for everyone. It requires unusual temperament and constant vigilance. Most people find firm beliefs comforting, even if those beliefs can't be proven. Most people prefer the security of conviction to the openness of perpetual inquiry. And that's fine. The skeptics never claimed their way was the only way or the best way for everyone. They simply demonstrated that it was a livable alternative to dogmatic certainty. But for those drawn to it, for those who find the skeptical temperament natural or develop it through practice, the rewards can be profound. A life of epoché is a life of remarkable freedom, free from defending positions you can't prove, free from the anxiety of possibly being wrong, free from the need to convert others to your view, free to learn from anyone, consider any argument, explore any possibility. And somewhere in that freedom, in that openness, in that refusal to cling to certainty, something like peace emerges, not because you've solved all problems, but because you've stopped creating the problem of demanding solutions you can't have. As you settle into rest tonight, consider carrying some small piece of skeptical wisdom with you. Perhaps you don't need to be certain about everything. Perhaps your beliefs could be held a bit more lightly, treated as provisional interpretations rather than final truths. Perhaps the anxiety you feel about some question might ease if you simply admitted you don't know and may never know. Perhaps uncertainty isn't the problem you've been treating it as. The ancient skeptics discovered something remarkable. They found that the human mind, that relentless judgment-making machine, can be quieted not by providing it with final answers, but by teaching it to suspend the search. They found that tranquility doesn't require knowing, but accepting not knowing. They found that wisdom might consist not in having correct beliefs, but in holding all beliefs lightly enough to let them go. And in that discovery, in that radical doubt, in that courageous acceptance of uncertainty, they stumbled upon a path to peace that remains available to anyone willing to walk it. The path doesn't lead anywhere in particular. It simply circles through the landscape of existence, investigating without concluding, questioning without answering, living without certainty. And somewhere along that path, like a shadow, following the skeptic's careful steps, tranquility appears, not because it was sought, but because the seeking for something else finally stopped. If you found wisdom in this exploration of ancient skepticism, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more philosophical journeys designed for peaceful reflection. Your support helps these conversations continue, bringing the timeless insights of great thinkers to those who seek understanding in the quiet hours. Rest well, knowing that certainty is not required for peace, that doubt need not be disturbing, and that the ancient skeptics found in radical uncertainty something more valuable than any dogmatic truth. Sweet dreams, fellow seekers. May your sleep be as tranquil as Pyrrho's legendary calm, and may you wake refreshed, ready to face tomorrow's questions with the gentle skepticism that transforms anxiety into wonder.